McKinsey. And then I met McKinsey. And this is another interesting lesson. So my first project at McKinsey, and I decided I'd been a summer associate at McKinsey in New York, but my wife is from Kentucky, and she was big on the idea that, hey, we need to get out of the Northeast and try something different. Glenn, you've lived in New York and you've lived in Boston, and New York and Boston. You need to get out and try something else. So I said, that's a good idea. So I got this offer to go to McKinsey in Houston, which I took. And I think there's a great entrepreneurial lesson. In order to see ideas, you need to go out and see new places and do new things. And there's a lot of people in the room who are from different places. I see some Americans, I see some people from around. I'm hypothesizing. And I'm thinking that, and I think you'd agree that you see new things and you learn so much from being in a different culture, even within your own country, a different area of the country with different people, different, accents, different words, different ideas, different industries. Industries cluster around different places. So Houston is a lot of energy. New York is a lot of finance and advertising, media, and consumer products. Obviously California is a lot. Southern California, a lot of media, movies. So industries cluster, and by living somewhere else, you get to work in different industries and see different things. So I went to McKinsey in Houston. My first study ended up being this sort of telecom-related strategy study, just the kind of thing you'd think McKinsey would go and do. A big high-level strategy for a major corporation down there. My second study was like not what you'd think. It was a purchasing and materials management study project for a major utility. So it was like the most unglamorous thing any McKinsey team ever does. Literally going in trying to cut the cost of purchasing, of supply for a utility. And it was just it didn't sound very sexy, but the team with the people who were on it were very good. And so I was like, okay, sure, I'll do that. And plus, I had no choice because I was only a first-year associate, and it was, so. But I did this thing, and the group of people I worked with, there were like 3 or 4 people from McKinsey on my team, and we were kind of spread across this whole company, leading multiple client teams to try to attack different parts of their cost structure, and it sounded very unglamorous, but it was interesting because I really got into it, and I was leading teams trying to reduce the cost of the wire purchases, and trying to reduce the cost of poles, and trying to reduce the cost of transformers, both in terms of lowering inventories, increasing cycle, increasing inventory turns, also finding alternative suppliers, finding better ways to engineer the product, finding ways to lower the cost in all across the board, and also water treatment chemicals. And it turns out that every time you got a power plant, you got a whole bunch of water, you're turning into steam, and the water source is different at every plant. So the way you have to treat the water and keep it from scaling and doing all these bad things is different in every place. And it turns out that my client, which was Houston Lighting and Power, had like a different vendor for each of the 11 different plants had a different vendor. And we were able to basically take that spend, we were able to analyze it, come up with the data on all these different plants, assemble that data into one place, in one database, and then we're able to go out to the different vendors, the water treatment vendors, and it was both chemicals and service they provided, and we're able to negotiate a package deal where one vendor got the whole shooting match. And we were able to consolidate the spend and able to save, I forget the exact numbers, but it was sort of like a $12 million a year spend for the company, and we were able to save something like $4 million run rate per year. And the reason I go into detail, this was a mind-blowing experience for me, because here I'd been at Kraft, where the revenues are flat, the business doesn't do much every year, and suddenly, by looking at water treatment chemicals, one commodity at a utility, we just put $4 million a year on the bottom line. The value creation was like we'd created, if you took their PE multiple, it was like we'd created $50 or $60 million in value in like an 8-week project. And this was a mind-blowing experience. And so I got very interested in purchasing and materials management, in supply management. And I ended up doing I did a lot of other work, but I ended up doing a couple of different projects that were related to this. And then when I was at clients, even when it wasn't a purchasing or supply related project, I'd kind of suggest, hey, have you looked at your purchasing and supply management? I bet we can find some savings there, and try to add some additional value. That's another lesson, I think, is that 2 lessons out of that story is, one is that if you want to create value in your career and you want to be valuable and be successful, always find ways to create incremental value for your boss, for your company, for your client. Always find incremental ways to add value. Another thing is, it's the old lesson you probably have already learned here or learned in college, which is that it oftentimes isn't the course, it's the professor, right? You know, a lot of times the best things, the best educational experiences, you know, I never would have thought, you know, purchasing and materials management for a utility in Texas in the summer was going to be a great experience, and yet it sort of changed my life because the people I was working with were great, and I had an open mind, and I went into it, you know, full force. So anyway, you know, for the next 2.5 years, I play around with this whole idea of purchasing materials management. I decided to leave McKinsey. The lifestyle was a little rough on me. Plus, I'm not a, as you can tell, I'm not a quiet, retiring, behind the curtain, advising the guy in front of the camera sort of guy. I'm sort of an out front kind of guy. And the whole idea of being this quiet advisor in the background just didn't suit my personality very well. So I decided not to stay at McKinsey, but I let them know I was there. McKinsey's great. It was a great experience. I learned so much. And one thing they were great, they're great on exits. I told them I was leaving, and they said, okay, great, you know, do these less important projects while you look. And I spent 3 or 4 months looking, and I was again determined to find a business to start. And I thought about this whole purchasing thing. Could I do a purchasing consulting business? And I just couldn't quite pull it together. And I looked at for-profit education at the time. This is 1994. Couldn't quite pull it together. But at the same time, I'm doing a job search. Again, the same strategy. I'm going to look for entrepreneurial opportunities. I'm an entrepreneurial guy, but I'm also going to pursue my big name brand career. So I did that. I got this great offer from GE. And GE appealed, and basically they hired me into this thing called corporate business development. I don't know what they call it now, but it was an internal consulting group. Whole idea is we're going to hire people out of consulting firms who've been there, you know, 2, 3, 4 years, had a successful run at a consulting firm, who got both the analytical horsepower, et cetera, but also have leadership potential. We're going to bring them in. They're going to do internal consulting projects until they find, you know, a role for, you know, a line management role, and then within 12 to 24 months, they're going to go run some part of the business. And GE has a lot of businesses to run, so that appealed to me. The kind of people were my kind of people. They were dynamic. They were really willing to work very hard and long, and they paid a lot of money. And I'm sort of a capitalist at heart. I think that, you know, hey, you want to managing your own career, you want to pay attention, and actually managing entrepreneurial ideas too, or managing a business. You need to pay attention to who's paying you the most, because they're the people who value you the most, and you should go with that. So I went to GE, and I was there about 2 weeks. And of course, this internal consulting group had a group focused on M&A. It had a group focused on plant operations improvements. It had a group focused on pricing and marketing issues. And then it had like 2 guys working on purchasing, because nobody likes purchasing. Purchasing is this off-Broadway, unpopular, you know, thing in the back of the corporation. And I said, you know, I'm going to work on purchasing, because they said, what do you want to work on? I said, I'll do purchasing, because I think I can help you save a lot of money and create a lot of value for the company. So I'm there a couple weeks. And I'm looking at the way GE is sourcing. And I learned something very quickly. GE agreed with my experience from McKinsey, which was that in the 80s, American business went out to copy the Japanese manufacturing approach. And a lot of the idea was vertical, not vertical integration within the company, but it was sort of integration across, you know, supplier to buyer integration. You know, you'd choose your supplier, you'd co-locate them on your site, you'd kind of dub them as your supplier you're going to work with forever, and they'd be your partner. And then you're going to manage that relationship very closely and tightly. And that was kind of the model. And a lot of companies, American companies, did that in the 1980s. And by 1991, 92, 93, what was apparent is that when you tell somebody, you're my guy, you're the supplier we're going to deal with, you know, we're going to integrate, we're going to do all this stuff, we're going to set you up. When you do that, guess what happens? What happens when you do that? The price goes up, because they say, well, they can't change anymore. So you know, gee, the barriers to the barriers to new competition are great, and the switching costs are great because of all this integration work. And now, you know, we're going to, hey, every year it's not going to be a 3% increase, it's going to be a 6% increase, and it's certainly not going to be a decrease. And actually, right before I arrived in '94, GE had just finished this whole big analysis where they realized that their end prices to consumers were actually getting crunched down by about 1% a year, but their end prices paid to suppliers were going up 2% a year. And it was like, sort of, at the time, it was like a $100 million a year problem, this scissors going in the wrong direction. So I got turned on to that whole problem, and I saw in my reading that, and talking to people around the company, that GE really had taken a move, had moved dramatically away from the whole concept of partnership and much more towards a concept of competitive sourcing. And Jack Welch used to call it 2+1. Always have two suppliers for a given major commodity item, with one in the wings you could bring in to keep price pressure on them. And the whole idea was, yeah, work closely. Yeah, have tight, logistical supply chains. Yeah, work on all those things, but also have the competitive element. And they were doing things, they were doing all these sort of exotic sort of negotiations and auctions and things with suppliers. So it was, they'd literally have 5 suppliers in a room for a given contract, and they'd make them bid against each other for it. And there were all these manual processes for creating this competition. And I had done some work at McKinsey on natural gas markets, where natural gas markets until the late 80s had been regulated, and suddenly in the early 90s became competitive. And this whole concept of new sorts of traded online markets, new sorts of traded markets in commodities that had previously not been commoditized, was something I'd been thinking a lot about. And this was related to my sourcing and supply management work. And also in 1994, I was reading a lot about the internet. And I had been aware of the internet for a few years, but I hadn't really learned that much about it. But I was learning about it. And I was actually in Erie, Pennsylvania at the diesel locomotive, the train engine factory for GE. And I'm meeting with this guy. His name was Bill Blair, who was quite the internet guy. And I was talking with him about sourcing and my approach to sourcing. And it just hit me that, wow, we could create online markets to source direct materials for major corporations, including GE. That whether it was machine parts or metal stampings or steel, component, whatever, or electronic components or plastic injection moldings, whatever it is, you look at most things are common. Most manufactured stuff are combinations of metals, plastics, electronics, packaging materials, and shipping. Look at a car, look at a computer, look at that table. And there's different side things. There's wood products. But it's basically those sorts of things. And it was like, wow, we could create much more tradable, much more commoditized markets for a whole bunch of this stuff online. And that was the idea. And so what really crystallized that was we asked some people within GE Information Services in Northern Virginia to figure out whether we could do bidding across the TCP/IP network. This is before browsers or anything. But we asked them if they could create bidding. Could I have a supplier from India bid a number across the internet in real time? Could that happen? And they came back and they said, and then could we have another bid come in from somebody in Wichita, or another one come in from somebody in Hungary? They came back and said, not only can you do that, but because of the real-time nature of the speed of light, because the bids are going to hit a central server, we can not only have the bids come in, but basically with like a 2-second, even this time back in 1994, it was a thin package, with like a 2 or 3 second latency, we could have all the suppliers see the number. So the bid could come in, and everybody involved in the bid could see the number. And we could, in effect, create a real-time online auction, in this case, downward price. And I heard that this is like the 3rd week of June 1994, and I was like, the world is going to change. I mean, it was absolutely clear to me that this was a revolution. And so that was all I wanted to do from that point on. And it was funny, I went back, I made a presentation to my whole group. Here I am, the new guy, I've been there 2 months. I joined GE in May. It's like July 17th or something, 94. And the guy I was working for was Gary Reiner, who was the head of my group, subsequently became the CIO of GE, and he was a direct report to Jack Welch. And we were sort of a major part of Jack Welch's staff. So Jack wasn't in the room, but there's like these 40 people. I'm probably the youngest guy there. And I asked Gary if I could make a presentation. And I presented the idea. I called it GE Global Electronic Marketplace. And I presented this idea, and they just were like, what? Who the hell is this guy? And what is he talking about? Because I said, listen, we're going to change the way GE sources. We're going to change the way the world. And they just were so blown away. So, but I worked on that idea, and I worked on that idea for about 6 more months within GE. And in December of '94, after doing some experimentation and creating some trial software and doing some early experiments, I put a business plan on the table to the GE management, and this was to Gary. It was one level below Jack, but it was Gary and then a woman named Helene Runtag who ran GE Information Services. I said, here's the business. It's new, it's different, it's not EDI. They had an EDI business at the time. It wasn't EDI, but it was basically using the software to automate sourcing in a new way and helping GE divisions and companies outside to change the way they do sourcing. And basically their reaction was this: great idea, Glenn, you're a great guy, but how come this isn't a $100 million business in the first year? And I said, well, because it's new. It takes time. We got to, I'm sort of a big picture.